Ever wonder just how deep Star Trek goes? Do you spend your time thinking about the Trek multiverse? Hi, my name is Kyle, and this is Trekspertise, where we discuss all things Trek. Today's episode: does Star Trek need a reboot? The Star Trek multiverse is enormous. Not as enormous as the real universe we find ourselves in. I have it on good authority that for real space is big, really big. You just won't believe how vastly, hugely, mind-bogglingly big it is. But for a television and movie franchise, it's very large and operates on a pretty intense level of continuity. Star Trek has been on the air since 1966, nearly 50 years, and includes well over 700 episodes, 30 seasons of television, and 12 movies, with a 13th on the way. In all that material, the men, women, transgendered people, uncategorizable entities, and general aliens of Starfleet have accumulated a few inconsistencies and a smattering of otherwise ridiculous concepts that are now cemented in Trek canon. Does this ruin Star Trek? Is it worth continuing to play in the Star Trek multiverse despite these issues? Or should the whole thing be rebooted? To discuss this topic, here are two notable examples of Star Trek dealing with its own accumulated history and actually avoiding the need for a reset. The first example concerns how Trek has corrected itself previously, and the second example is a look at a future opportunity for dealing with Trek's sometimes bizarre in-universe history. Number 1. The successful example. All humanoid races in Star Trek have the same origin. In a Next Generation episode called The Chase, it is revealed that the source of all humanoid life in the galaxy comes from an ancient race of aliens that existed 4.5 billion with a B years ago. These aliens struck out into the galaxy and found it lonely and devoid of intelligent life. So they decided to seed it with some sort of genetic precursor material that would direct the evolution of life towards the humanoid form. Earth, Vulcan, Kronos, many worlds in Star Trek supposedly receive this treatment. It is a fair assumption that any humanoid species one may encounter in the Trek multiverse results from this generous genetic colonization. This is an interesting solution to a creative problem for Star Trek. Budgetary constraints mostly prevented the franchise early on from any realistic depiction of alien life, so it was cheaper, faster, and especially more convenient to Star Trek's purposes of narrative to depict humanoid aliens. How else can we talk about racism in our own society, for example, without objectively referring to some human-like being that an audience can identify with? However, if you know anything about biological evolution, even the slightest bit, even accidentally, you know that the idea of different evolutionary branches all leading to the humanoid form is hogwash, gibberish. Aliens will not look like us. We know this now more than ever scientifically, because of advances in thinking concerning exobiology, astronomy, and many other sciences touched by the exploration of space over the last 50 years. Just looking at Kepler data alone has changed our understanding of the habitability of a world. But certainly TV audiences are more aware now than they ever were in the 1960s of these changes, when humanoid aliens may have felt realistic, when general Americans found themselves to be at the pinnacle of the natural world through an inherent progression of forms from least complex to most. Yet, an evolutionary scheme where humans are invariably on top is an incorrect interpretation of how evolution works, built upon a child's understanding of biological evolution. It simply does not work this way. Humans are not special, unique snowflakes in the care of a special evolutionary paradigm built just for them. We are cool, no doubt, and evolution produced us this way, but there was no pre-planning going on. Evolution is a long-term process with short-sighted goals. So, this clever creative workaround with the Star Trek founder race solves the humanoid alien improbability problem, and, at the same time, fits in perfectly with Trek's overall social theme, that all the different human groups of Earth are one family, one race, and one species. For those people out there clamoring for a Trek reboot, never forget that a little creativity can go a long way. The founder race solution is perfectly compatible with Trek canon and, mostly, somewhat compatible with a more modern scientific understanding of evolution. As far as this point is concerned, no reboot is necessary. Number 2. The future potential example. Dinosaurs evolved human comparable intelligence. No, really, dinosaurs. Wait, that's not quite a dinosaur. Oh, and neither is that, unfortunately. Now these are dinosaurs. So, in Star Trek, it is revealed that an offshoot species of dinosaur, specifically the hadrosaur, evolved intelligence on Earth and left to go out into space at some point deep in Earth's past. The species is the Voth, and this odd historical circumstance is revealed in the Voyager episode Distant Origin. The USS Voyager bumps into the Voth nearly 70,000 light-years from Earth, traveling around in a great big multi-generational civilization ship. Now this sounds a bit ridiculous, but if you start to think about deep evolutionary time, and the smaller length of time humanity has managed to evolve its own intelligence, it isn't completely impossible, evolutionarily speaking. Maybe it's highly, highly improbable instead. Regardless, lots of creatures have evolved impressive amounts of intelligence even during our own evolutionary context, resulting in some truly alien mental landscapes right here on Earth. Anyway, this episode deals with science versus religion, to a degree, as the Voth subscribe to a perspective of their origins called doctrine, which excludes the idea of a planetary origin entirely. A Voth scientist discovers that they may be from Earth after all. The scientist in question gets called out by supporters of doctrine. Religious suppression, comparison hijinks ensue. Needless to say, it is difficult for the imaginary Voth society to swallow the whole Earth idea, as it seems to be for some real humans in our own real time period. How does this episode deal with what some might refer to as the burdensome accumulated history of the Star Trek multiverse? Well, it hasn't. At least not yet. It's actually produced some canon that others will have to either work around or interact with entirely. From now on, the Earth that exists in the Star Trek multiverse is one that produced two spacefaring intelligent species, albeit millions of years apart from each other. Some fans and writers may balk at this prospect. However, I feel that this is an opportunity. Let's just say that, hypothetically, the Voth eventually allow themselves to understand the truth, that they are from Earth. Then, they decide that they need to settle in their original homeland. That would make for an interesting movie, or maybe a whole season-long story arc in a future Trek television show, where the Voth show up at Earth's doorstep and demand that the humans make room for their entire civilization. Kind of like the formation of the modern state of Israel, in a way. This is an idea originally proposed by Mungo Baobab of Reddit's Daystrom Institute. Just putting that out there in the mental universe of Trek fans because it is a creative example of how to utilize Trek's accumulated history to perpetuate Roddenberry's vision of both solving problems through cooperation and being inclusive of the other. Besides, it'll be a compelling reason to stick Patrick Stewart back in a Starfleet uniform. Because let's face it, only Jean-Luc Picard could negotiate through such a potentially tense situation like that, a situation that has been dealt with before in science fiction. For the minority of Trek fans clamoring for a reboot, know that reboots aren't necessary, but creativity is definitely warranted to maintain in-universe coherence. This is why I love The Chase, because it proves that a little bit of thinking is a great substitute for tossing out the baby with the bathwater. We can deal with Trek's history and still play in the Trek multiverse. Many consider the newest Trek films to effectively be a Star Trek reboot, and indeed the new Abrams movies do feel this way. So much so that it has created an ongoing division among Trek fans, probably the largest such rift among the fandom in the history of the Star Trek franchise. It is important to note that Team Abrams really did not want to break completely with Trek continuity, despite being pulled into the fashionable Hollywood prequel reboot craze. The newest Star Trek movies emphasized continuity on purpose with the whole alternate timeline exposition. Team Abrams certainly must have known what the fans know, that the prime Star Trek universe we all love and admire is still a viable mechanism for telling stories. Yet the powers that be still felt it necessary to distance themselves from that particular Trek universe. This is a conflicted position for the franchise and one that will not be resolved soon. However, the Star Trek multiverse is still fun, interesting, and especially relevant. Just because its history is gigantic and, in some areas, conflicted, doesn't mean that its utility as a tool of Roddenberry-style storytelling is nil. The existing Trek multiverse is still a place worth exploring. Looking at it from another perspective, the desire to reboot the franchise can be seen as a simple failure of imagination. Thank you for watching. Please feel free to suggest future topics in the comments below, and keep an eye on us for future installments.